Hi, my name is Ethan Connell, and this is the history of voter suppression, part one of the Battered Ballots series on voter suppression. Now, we've split this topic into four distinct eras, the post-Civil War and the Reconstruction era, the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights era, and the present day. And we're going to lead right in with the Reconstruction era. The Reconstruction era is notable in itself as it is where we see the first instances of voter suppression against the African American community. Now, voter suppression begins as intimidation and violent acts against the African American people in order to prevent them from voting and participating in the political process. But as the Reconstruction era and the 19th century continues, it evolves into this legally sanctioned method of suppression through poll taxes and literacy tests, which are upheld by local state governments. The Ku Klux Klan is this entity in the South, which is really important to this topic because not only did they participate in the intimidation and the violent acts that prevented African Americans from voting and tried to keep them from voting, but they were also comprised of these prominent Southern figures in society, lawyers, judges, politicians, businessmen, and they created these legal methods of voter suppression. They instituted these poll taxes and literacy tests as a method of keeping African Americans from voting. And as we move later into American history, into the Jim Crow era, we see voter suppression become not just rampant in the South, but almost a dominant force in Southern politics. And it's marked by a transition from like the physical intimidation and violence that we saw from groups like the Ku Klux Klan into more legally ingrained methods. This is where we have support from Southern judges, politicians, the police. It's this transition from, group actions to institutional actions, which is very important. And it's in the Jim Crow era that we see the expansion of these discriminatory government practices. We see the birth of property checks, which is basically the state mandating that in order to cast a ballot, you have to be a property owner, which more often than not in this day and age meant that you had to be white. And we'll touch on this later when we talk about the actual methods of voter suppression themselves specifically. But this is where voter roll purges begin, which is a phenomena that continues into the modern day. And these systems of oppression continue well into the 20th century. And it's in the 20th century itself that we see voter suppression become this true monster. It envelops not just the South, the former Confederacy, but almost the entire United States political system as a whole in its day. Leading up to the Civil Rights era, which we'll touch on in just a second, there's this cycle of vicious suppression where you have these politicians who have exploited these methods of suppression in order to gain and maintain power. You have these groups who want to vote you out of office, and you're removing their voice in politics. You're removing their ability to vote you out. They're going to do everything in their power to reinforce, maintain, and institute more methods to continue this cycle. And this continues well into the 1960s. And it's supported by the United States Supreme Court itself. They routinely upheld grandfather clauses, poll taxes, under the guise of states' rights, that it was the state's right to decide what was best in its political structure. And it's through this that we see new methods of voter suppression. Again, we'll talk about this more in the specific episode in which we will discuss the methods of voter suppression. But we see these methods of voter suppression become more legally ingrained. It's harder to distinguish bias from legal fact in this era. Obviously, now it's easy to do it in hindsight, but in that day and age, it was hard. But there is a silver lining to this cloud, as good of a silver lining you can get with such an awful topic. The 1960s is this catalyst. The civil rights movement is this catalyst for change within voter suppression as a topic. You see the Warren Court, the Supreme Court headed by Earl Warren, start to strike down a lot of these laws. You see the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which meant that, no longer can a state, overtly discriminate for the basis of race when it comes to voting. And all of these were really, really important measures in the combating of voter suppression. But unfortunately, it didn't erase it. And that's when we move into the modern era, today's world. And after things like the Voting Rights Act and the Supreme Court taking a stand, it's this transition, like the transition that we saw in the Reconstruction era to the Jim Crow era, where they had to become, less overt. It's that, again, in which these methods of voter suppression become incredibly subversive and hard to spot. And it's in today's society that we see incredibly new and evolved methods of voter suppression. Misinformation has come to the forefront as one of the most important. With the advent of mass media and social media, the dispersion of information is able to happen within seconds, within fraction of a second, even, from countryside to countryside. And that's regardless of whether or not that information is true or incorrect. In the 2016 and 2020 elections, there were numerous instances in which political actors were able to get faulty information out to the voter base. People were told that the election had been moved to different days. People were told their voter registration was invalid. It's those kind of tactics in order to prevent people from voting, which are those subversive actions that we were talking about earlier. We also see the development of voter ID laws, which is a relatively new phenomenon in the past 30, 40 or so years. And we'll talk about this again later in more detail when we talk about the methods of voter suppression themselves specifically. But it's when the state requires that you have a photo ID in order to cast your ballot, which is shown to disproportionately target low-income and minority communities. And we also see felony disfranchisement, which has been a very recent source of contention, especially here in the state of Virginia, in which the state will retract the rights, the voting rights of felons, because they have a specific lack of judgment, which was proved by them committing a felony. Now, it's been proven time and time again, numerous studies, which I will link below, that felony disenfranchisement in itself disproportionately targets the African American community, and there's really no correlating evidence between the committing of the felonious crime and a lack of judgment that would be substantive enough in order to warrant taking away the right to vote. And that concludes my presentation for this episode, at least. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Our social media pages will be linked in the description below as well if you want to leave any comments or questions there. And please stay tuned for part 2. Thank you for watching.